Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Rapid Response webinar to the recent events in Israel. The news from Israel is deeply worrisome. A new proposal by the coalition government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to overhaul the judiciary has sparked a wave of mass protests unprecedented in recent Israeli history. The proposed legislation would significantly weaken the judiciary and allow Netanyahu's government, which includes several far-right factions, greater control over the appointment of judges and other important issues. Liberals and secular Israelis fear this move will undermine its democracy. And when Benjamin Netanyahu's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, pointed out the risk of the proposed reforms to Israeli national security, especially the fact that reservists were threatening not to report to duty or carry out orders, he was unceremoniously sacked, has not yet received a letter of dismissal or termination. But that set off an even larger round of protests on Monday. And in response, Netanyahu announced on Monday night that he would postpone a vote on the controversial legislation until after Knesset's holidays for Passover. By hitting the pause button, Netanyahu may have bought himself time for tensions to simmer, but also to negotiations to get underway. Meanwhile, his own popularity has declined. His own political future remains uncertain as Israeli democracy hangs in the balance. So the moment is clearly an inflection point for the state of Israel. And the pause gives us here at SIPA the opportunity to take stock of fast-moving situation. It's a fast-moving situation, and also to discern what this means for the future of Israeli democracy, what it means for Netanyahu's coalition government, for his own political survival, but also for U.S. Israel relations writ large, as well as the wider backslide in democracy we are seeing across the globe. Here, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, we are committing to producing high-profile events and tapping our network of amazing speakers, friends, supporters to discuss big and important issues, and you've seen this throughout the year. But we're also a policy school, and so today's webinar is a kind of a new format we're trying where we try to provide more rapid response analysis on events in the news. Now, we hope to hold more of these webinars going forward. And to that end, we are very fortunate to have such esteemed experts with us to help answer these questions. And I must say, I'm very, very grateful for their willingness to do this in such short notice, despite everything that is going on, both in the semester and in Israel. Here with us, we have Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, United States Ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. We have Mr. Aluf Benn, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz. Haaretz is the longest-running Israeli newspaper. And Dr. Lisa Anderson, Special Lecturer, and the James Shotwell Professor of International Relations Emerita, as well as the former Dean of Columbia SIPA. Thank you for lending us your time and expertise, and for all of you for being with us. Let's jump right in. All right, Aluf Benn, I'm going to start with you. And let's kind of start with what's happening in Israel. Given your ground's eyes view, there is real uncertainty at the moment about the future of the negotiations between the government, the coalition, and the opposition. To what extent will the protesters be willing, on the one hand, to accept a compromise at this point? Was the firing of the Minister of Defense a red line for them? But also, if you look at the flip side, going to thinking about the coalition, what's the likelihood that the far-right elements of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition or him himself will be willing to really water down this reform package?
Well, the firing of the defense minister happened on the night before the crucial vote on the Judicial Appointments Committee and the proposed bill that would give any coalition complete control over judicial appointments. That was seen as the heart of the entire reform upheaval, overall coup, no matter what you want to call it, proposed by Netanyahu and by Justice Minister Yariv Levin. And that was taken back for a while, but the government is still pledging to pass it. Frankly, I don't see, from the point of view of the protesters, I don't see any possible compromise that besides just taking it all back or making some face-saving cosmetical changes to the status quo that would be acceptable. And on the other hand, I can't see the other side, the coalition, willing to forego what became its main raison d'etre. In the coalition-building governments, which were the blueprint for this cabinet, the judicial reform was declared as the first and foremost, most important top issue, most urgent, no matter how many superlatives were there to call it. So just backing off and say, okay, these guys went to the streets and we're calling it back, I don't think so. The right wing is now trying to run its own counter demonstrations. Mm-hmm. There have been several violent incidents, mostly outside of the main protest area in Tel Aviv. Right. And clearly what Netanyahu would try to achieve through the timeout, through the negotiations, and through building power in his own base is to separate between the mainstream protesters that were really unprecedented and the diehard anti-Netanyahu protest that has been going on for years and will go on for years regardless of this. And just to isolate them and go on. If they water it down from a full majority to some kind of tiny cosmetic compromise, this might be. But I don't see them changing their basic ideological motive, which is to be able to stay in power for as long as they want, which is forever, basically.
So let's talk a little bit about the protesters themselves. Now, how large and representative of the population are they? After all, Netanyahu's spokespeople have argued that reforms are backed by a majority of the population. I think I saw something 58%, or I might be wrong, but what can you tell us a little bit about the protesters themselves? Who are they? And is it really left-wing? Is it also factions from Likud who are joining?
I would say that the protesters, by and large, are the people representing the old Israel, Israel of the Labour Party, Israel of the national unity governments. These are mostly people from the center, people who are proud that their military credentials. Secular by and large. Of course, there are some religious people in the protest. There are some non-Ashkenazi people in the protest. There are younger and younger people. As the protest went on week after week, younger and younger people came to Kaplan Street and elsewhere. And but there are the Arab society by and large stayed on the sidelines. They see it as an intra-Jewish affair. As they say, they don't like the status quo. So if the debate is between the status quo and a worse situation, they'd rather wait and see. The ultra-Orthodox supporting the part and parcel of the Netanyahu coalition and supporting at least some parts of judicial reform strongly, they also stayed on the sidelines. And when some of the protesters came to Bnei Brak, to the ultra-Orthodox town, to protest against their military draft exemption, they were accepted with flowers and hugs, and the ultra-Orthodox leadership decided not to confront them. Mm-hmm. Regarding the argument that the majority of Israelis back to reform, the coalition won a very solid majority of 64 out of 120 members of Knesset. In Israel, it's a landslide. In Israel, it's usually 61, maximum 62. It's a landslide. This was because of the election system, which threw two opposition parties below the threshold. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that according to all public opinion surveys taken since the reform was launched by Minister Levin in January, the majority does not support it. And that includes voters of Likud and some of the more moderate, I would say, Zionist Orthodox voters.
So one of the biggest questions of the day, how do you think this all ends for Netanyahu and his own political trajectory? We saw the polls on Monday. Obviously, his popularity has declined significantly. Benny Gantz, as now, I think he gained a lot in terms of in popularity among in the polls. Can Bibi recover from this crisis, and under what conditions and in what way?
I think Gantz is really the representative of this protest, both by his military credentials as former chief of staff and defense minister, the way he talks, his background is very, very much the symbol of this protest, and that's why he gains so much in the polls due to it. Look, as for Netanyahu, since the campaign, knowing that if he wins, he would have to put together a very right-wing and ultra-Orthodox coalition. He was trying to play, and even after the election, they played the role of the middleman. The guy was telling the right-wingers, look, without me, you would never be able to fulfill any of your dreams. And telling the left-wingers, I'm your only friend here, and I'm the only one who could protect you. That was broken when he sided firmly with the far right on the judicial overhaul. There was no way for him to come back and convince the other side that he's really the go-between or the middleman there. Now, the question for Netanyahu is, what kind of legacy does he want? If you read his book and his old speeches about security and Churchill and Iran, and promoting his book on the New York Times and MSNBC rather than Fox News, you'd be surprised at this sharp turn to the right. On the other hand, if his legacy now is replacing the elites and building a kind of authoritarian right-wing rule forever, regardless of what people in the New York Times might say about him, then he's on the right way. But I think it's still out. We can't tell. He can still back off. He can still find some other toy to play with and somehow. Because the far right, in the end, they have nowhere else to go. They have no one else to turn to, and their voters would still like them to stay in the coalition with Netanyahu, even if it's not all the way, but halfway or quarter way there.
I have so many more questions, but the last one for you for now.
Yeah.
If we go back to how this all started, this judicial reform, so can you describe who are the players in this far-right coalition government demanding this? How worried should minority groups, LGBTQ groups, the Arab Israelis, how should it be about the ability of politicians now really to pick judges, given that Israel does not have a constitution? What really is at stake for those minority groups? If you can just state this briefly. And
they have a lot to worry about. Look, in Israel, the only break, the only balance to government power is the Supreme Court. And the Attorney General was appointed by the cabinet, but has a lot of independence as the custodian of the rule of law in Israel in a 6-year term. The current coalition wants to break it because they don't like the rulings of the Supreme Court. They see them as too liberal, both in terms of equality. They don't like equality to Palestinians in the West Bank. They don't like equality to the Arab society in Israel. They don't like equality to other minorities. They don't like the religion to be in second status compared to secular rulings. And to them, this is an opportunity to change it once and for all. Now, if the only institution protecting minority rights, protecting the freedom of speech, protecting equality, there's no constitution in Israel, but there's no other law in Israel that is that even declares that equality of all citizens or that freedom of speech is an important value. It's all in the Supreme Court rulings and decisions over the years. And if the Supreme Court is gone or weakened,
significantly weakened,
then each and every one, including freedom of the press, of us, who is protected by the court, should be very, very worried.
And on this pessimistic note, we will turn to Ambassador Shapiro. So then what's at stake here beyond what's the domestic politics in Israel? What's the stake for the United States, U.S. Israel relations? How can really Washington prevent further democratic backsliding in Israel? And the criticism, of course, from some Israelis would be, well, this is a domestic issue about how we govern, about, please butt out. So is there a really U.S. interest involved in how Israel is governed? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Karen. Good to be with you and the SIPA community. President Biden's made several statements about this, where he's talked about how the heart of the foundation, really, of the U.S. Israel relationship, which is a very productive relationship for both sides. There's a great deal of security cooperation, intelligence sharing, economic partnership, but the beating heart of it and the foundation to the common democratic values, democratic institutions, democratic norms of two democratic societies. That's what enables everything else, all that other intermittent cooperation and the wide and deep support for the relationship across the societies, even when governments change. So, of course, President Biden also has talked about a broader concern about democratic erosion worldwide. And we all know many examples. And of course, we all know we're dealing with that in our own democracy. So those are concerns that he has raised. And so the interest that implicates is that if steps are taken in Israel, if decisions are taken about the balance of powers between the different branches of government, such that there's a concentration of power in one branch of government with no separation of powers, no checks and balances, not the rule of law as we understand it, and so that many Israeli citizens, including very many senior officials, from judges to generals to economists to people who Prime Minister Netanyahu himself appointed to many of these senior positions in previous governments, if they are saying, and of course many others in the democratic family of nations are saying, that the system is no longer characteristic of democratic society, that is going to obviously put some strain on the U.S. Israel relation and implicate the ability to do that cooperation. Now, just on the point about butt out, well, of course, I think this is obviously clear. Only Israelis can make these decisions. The Israeli people and the Israeli government. And, there's even much to praise about what one has seen about the discourse and the citizenry's involvement in this. So they'll make this decision one way or the other. But if it can affect U.S. interests, the outcome of that decision can affect U.S. interests, the U.S. is going to have a view. And if it can affect U.S. interests, the U.S. can state its view. And then Israelis can decide whether or not to take that view into account as these decisions are made.
Yeah. So let's talk about U.S.-Israel relations and put it a little bit in a kind of a larger, broader context, which is very relevant given your experience at the time where you were ambassador. So President Biden said that he will not invite Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House in the near future. Now, we all remember, and you were ambassador at the time, the chilly relationship between President Obama and Netanyahu. Would you call this a crisis in U.S.-Israel relations? And if so, how should we de-escalate? So if you can kind of compare the two episodes and where are we now, how can we de-escalate this, how bad it is?
Well, I think the concern about whether or not that foundation of the relationship is going to remain as solid and what it has always been, those common democratic practices and institutions and values, is a significant inflection point and hopefully one that doesn't lead to a deterioration. But that's sort of big and strategic and long-term. The question about whether or not or when Prime Minister Netanyahu comes to Washington for a meeting at the White House with President Biden, I don't think that's in the category of crisis, or it's very minor, frankly, the exact timing of that. The two of them, by the way, have good personal ties for many years. They both have a clear desire to avoid friction, and they've made that clear. There are some in there, well, at least on the Israeli side, one heard a lot of maybe backbenchers trying to whip this up into a crisis when President Biden said the other day that there wouldn't be a visit in the near term, and then Prime Minister Netanyahu, after a few hours, kind of shut that down. But I think both governments, administrations are trying to downplay that. Now, any Israeli prime minister would want to have an early visit with the president. That's normal, and that's how very important strategic coordination takes place on the big items on the agenda. In this case, Iran, expanding the Abraham Accords, of course, dealing with the Palestinian issue. But it's, I think, understandable that President Biden cannot really have that visit at the moment when there's a risk of the week before or the week after Israel passing legislation that he has already identified serious concern to U.S. interests about democratic erosion broadly and in this relationship. Now, that's not a healthy situation, generally speaking. It's obviously best when a president of the United States and a prime minister of Israel are able to meet at any time that their schedules can permit and do that deep, intimate consultation on the common interests we have. So it's a point of concern. I don't like the word crisis because people throw it around so much, but I want them to be able to meet, and this is not a moment when it's really appropriate for them to meet.
Right. So let's shift to regional threats. Well, we all know that the Iranian threat is very much there, and it's in the news, right? We know that Iran nears a nuclear threshold status. And let's try to connect what's happening domestically with this. So, what are the implications of this political crisis for what we see happening with Iran's behavior, but also in the Iranian nuclear issue? We know that one reason we saw the massive protests on Monday is when Gallant and others were trying to, were starting to voice really their, how this affects Israel national security. And we all think about Iran as a looming threat, and there is maybe a window. What do you make of that? How much of these are connected, and in what way?
Well, it's obviously connected when a minister of defense, a member of the prime minister's own party, a supporter of the judicial reform, even the fairly strong version of it, stands up and says, if we pass this now and in this way, and over the strong objections of many reservists in the military, many others in Israeli society, we will be harming our own national security, harming our own readiness. Obviously, you have to take that seriously. I think the Israeli people did take it seriously, and that was demonstrated by that sort of spontaneous eruption into the streets that Sunday night, not a scheduled demonstration, one that really was a reaction to the firing of our defense minister who has just said those things. I think there's several layers to this. Iran, of course, sees this chaos going on. And it's always, to an adversary's or any country's advantage when their adversary is in some state of disarray. It may be a time when Iran is tempted to strike Israel in various ways. Of course, they've got operations and facilities in Syria. They have terrorist organizations that they sponsor elsewhere. Maybe a time when they try to push a little bit further down the road toward threshold status of the nuclear program. Of course, they're already pretty much there. So there's that temptation. There is this worry about decreased IDF readiness when significant numbers of reservists and especially Air Force pilots said they're not going to volunteer for their reserve duty, which includes flying combat missions and certainly training. And they'd obviously be called upon if there was a conflict with Iran, because they did not feel comfortable that they might be taking orders from a non-democratic system. And then, of course, the U.S. Israel coordination. It goes on. There have been important visits during this period by cabinet ministers, cabinet secretaries, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Israel, and senior Israeli officials to Washington. I'm sure that is still going on, but this is not exactly the atmosphere you would want to have for Israel turning to its closest ally and saying, let's coordinate the next phase of this sort of inflection point, past this inflection point where Iran has reached nuclear threshold status. You'd want greater confidence, and you wouldn't want all the oxygen being sucked out of the discussion by this one judicial overhaul proposal.
So do you see then risk of regional escalation in tensions in terms of Israel's adversaries taking advantage on the one hand, or on the flip side, a diversionary war on part of Bibi to try to divert public attention from this to something else that unites the public? Do you see risks of that?
Well, I do see risk that Israel's enemies could be tempted. Hamas in Gaza, or even in the West Bank, Hezbollah in South Lebanon, Iran, which we just talked about, certainly could be tempted to say this is a moment of Israel being distracted, of Israel being divided, of Israel being in some state of chaos, maybe Israel's readiness being degraded, and maybe we can put some points on the board. I don't think anyone believes that they could defeat Israel in a major war, but of course they seek smaller gains in maybe more episodic conflicts. Obviously, if there were such a strike, it would be somewhat unifying on the Israeli side, because there is, I think, still a very strong unifying culture around dealing with those things. Now, you do hear occasional speculation about what we might call a wag the dog scenario of the prime minister saying, well, this is how I can shift the agenda and rally people around me. Aluf mentioned his sort of declining popularity. Maybe rally people back to his side by saying, stand with me as we go against our enemies. Frankly, it's not his history, and I think we have to be fair about that he has not sought to have military adventures for political purposes. But obviously, if that question is even raised, if there's a public perception or among some of the protesters or even some in the army who see orders they might be given or operations that might be launched as having some political motivation, that could be damaging to the esprit de corps and the unity that you would want in such a situation.
So before we return to my colleague, Lisa Anderson, last question, what's not part of this debate? And it seems to me that the Palestinians and the Palestinian issue, we're not hearing about what are the implications of this for this. So what are the implications for the Israeli-Palestinian issue? How does that affect U.S. perspective? Where do you see the link there, if one exists?
Well, Palestinians don't have much trust or faith in the Israeli government, and probably more so this coalition, a very right-wing coalition. But even in the Supreme Court in its current configuration, there have been many Supreme Court decisions that Palestinians would have disagreed with and found disadvantageous in terms of what they permit the Israeli military to do or Israeli settlement expansion. But that doesn't mean that if this proposal were to go through, it couldn't affect the Israeli-Palestinian arena and Palestinian interests. There are different motivations for different parts of the coalition to support this judicial overhaul. But one of the motivations of one part, the religious Zionist party, that's Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, very extreme settler leaders, one of their motivations is that they have found it unacceptable that the court has periodically blocked certain forms of settlement expansion, such as legalizing illegal outposts or permitting building of settlements or legalizing them if they were built on private Palestinian land. And so, their goal is actually to tie the court's hands so it can't do that. And if that would enable an even further expansion and further entrenchment of Israel's presence in the West Bank, that could certainly contribute to ending whatever slim prospects remain for some kind of separation in a two-state solution. So it's not as if there's nothing at stake on the West Bank, and it's not as if that's not one of the stories or motivations behind the push for this overhaul.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Lisa, turning to you, let's examine the historical implications of this crisis. Can you put this latest wave of protests in a broader perspective? What implications does it have, for example, increasing authoritarianism, or as an example of regime learning, which is obviously your area of expertise?
Well, Thank you, Karen. I think it is true that if you look at the sort of history of what sort of contemporary authoritarianization, which we see across the world, this is a textbook example. So, you know, if you look at Orban in Hungary, or you look at Modi in India, or you look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, or you look at Trump in the United States, there are certain kinds of things that you pull out from the playbook, including moving your control of the judiciary so that the language is this, which I like a lot. Instead of the rule of law, you have the rule by law. So everything seems legal, but of course, that's because you've captured your judiciary. So this would be pretty standard practice at this point. Lots of people would recognize it. There is some speculation that Poland, for example, may have suggested some of this. It doesn't seem, you know, it's hard to tell whether that, nobody in Israel needs Poland to suggest it. It's an open book of a set of, you know, moves you can make if you want to control in the context of appearing to be accountable, appearing to have been, of course, elected, and so forth and so on. So this is not the old style military coup. This is a different way of producing authoritarian government, but it's pretty classic. And I think one of the things about the protests is that the fact that it has taken place in other places means that the Israeli public is probably a little bit more sensitive to it than would have been the case had we not already seen this happen around the world. So to some extent, the protests are a reflection of not just regime learning, but also, if you will, popular learning. That if you don't nip this in the bud, if you don't take the first step as indicative of a plan, then you're going to regret that. Now, there are obviously special elements in this of the power the Supreme Court has had in Israel in the absence of a constitution and so forth and so on. It is quite the jewel in the crown if you were trying to authoritarianize, but nonetheless, this is pretty recognizable.
So one of the major events during the Trump administration, and the big achievement that people attributed to Benjamin Netanyahu, was the ability to normalize relations with other Arab countries, the Abraham Accords, and now we were discussing until not very recently even the possibility of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia fully, and so on. What are the implications of this for the future of those kinds of relationship, of the Abraham Accord, and so on, in your mind?
Well, keep in mind that there aren't very many people in the Middle East and North Africa that think of Israel as a democracy.
Yes.
Anyway, so you have a democracy for the Jewish community of Israel, but that's not the entire country. And so you already have most people sort of primed to say, honestly, you know, if there's a sort of hot family feud among the ruling establishment of Israel, that's their business. It's of no consequence. And moreover, think about the other members, the Abraham Accords. These are not democracies. Why would they care? In fact, to some degree, having Israel look more like them, as opposed to them looking more like Israel, would be fine. That just makes life infinitely easier for everybody. Nobody has to pay lip service to human rights or so forth and so on. So I think the regional view on the part of the governments, particularly the Abraham Accord governments, or by extension, Egypt and so forth, would not be unhappy, to tell you the truth, if the Israeli government was more familiar looking, somewhat more autocratic, less accountable, because that's always a trial if you're not accustomed to it. So from the regional point of view, I actually think most of it is bemused. Most of it is, you know, watching this happen, kind of interested. Clearly, these are governments that know a fair amount about the Israeli political scene and know a fair amount about Netanyahu individually. I think he is credited with the accords, and so they wouldn't necessarily even want to see him fail here. One quick thing it occurred to me as you were talking to Dan about the Americans. I also think that in the region as a whole, there really is, the Chinese capacity to engineer the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement suggests that, the United States just isn't what it once was anyway. So if you're getting the United States mad, that's not quite as much the umbilical cord, even for Israel, as it once was. It certainly isn't for the Saudis. The Saudis are pretty comfortable in having a prickly relationship with at least the Biden administration. And I don't think they would be surprised if there were other countries in that boat.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask about the Chinese involvement, but this almost is a topic of a different webinar that we should do, but it's definitely related. Let me ask you one last question, and then I want to open it up to all panelists. So we've seen really mass demonstrations in Israel. Again, unprecedented in the recent history. I don't remember seeing so many people, so many young people coming out. So let's put this also in kind of perspective. There were demonstrations in Iran, different, but response to the death of Masha Amini, an Iranian woman who was arrested for wearing a hijab. You see demonstrations in Israel. Are there similarities? Where do you see the patterns? What are the similarities, the differences in how we're thinking about those protests and demonstrations against regimes that you see in the region? And obviously very different countries and very different contexts, but.
Well, you actually have seen them for the last 15 or 20 years all over the world. You had Occupy Wall Street, you had Hong Kong, you had, this is something, you get these eruptions of popular discontent, precipitated very often by something that seems sort of random, since in many of these countries, the abuses that produced them had gone on before. So you see a kind of flash mob mobilization, clearly shaped, or at least provoked in some respects by social media. You can get lots of people out, you can get them quickly, everybody is enraged. What seems to be happening, and this remains to be seen in Israel, obviously, is that they fade away just as quickly. They don't have as much lasting power as sort of the old style organized, we used to think of it as syndicalism, or, there were protests historically, obviously, through more than the 20th century. These tend to be deliberately not organized, make a point, and then fade away. So even the uprisings in the Arab world and throughout the teens, starting in 2010, they may have overturned an individual government. Did they actually change the underlying structure of political power? No. So most, as it stands now, most of these protests don't seem to be effective at really moving the needle a lot, in terms of, so they may, in this instance, maybe Netanyahu would back down a little bit on the Supreme Court for a while. That seems to have happened. Is it actually going to change the underlying tension between what I would describe as the sort of cosmopolitans in Israel and the nativists in Israel, which is the same tension you see in Hungary, the same tension you see in Brazil? This is about income inequality. It's about really fundamental social change. And the protests don't address that. So they are satisfying emotionally for those who participate in them, but they actually don't change very much about the dynamics of politics.
Thank you, Lisa. I see Aluf. Aluf, you want to jump in on this?
Just a couple sentences. There is one striking similarity between the protests in Iran and Israel, different in scope, different in violence, different in government reaction. But in Israel, the subtext, one of the most important subtexts of this protest is the fear of the seculars in Israel of being pushed away by the larger, by the dynamics of ultra-Orthodox demography, and the fact that the blueprint of this cabinet, the coalition building agreements, describe way more religion in private and public life. And we just passed a bill, the Knesset just passed a bill making it more problematic to bring non-matzah bread during Passover, which is next week, into hospitals. And you see one of the most striking episodes of the protest was a group of women wearing the red robes of the Handmaid's Tale, which we all saw on television, and the secular religious tension is a very strong subtext of the protest in Israel. Obviously, in Iran, it's the reason for the protest. And again, the Iranians are going through much harder way of life and much more violent for the reaction of the government to the protest, etc. But it's not totally dissimilar.
Thank you, Aluf. And Dan, do you want to respond or pick up this question about what to make of this in terms of the great power competition, the role of the United States in the area, especially as China is making inroads? Like, do you agree that we are also there in some sort of an inflection point, and something about what's happening in Israel right now could also shift that in some ways?
Well, it's a moment when clearly China is seeking to compete with the United States. There are ways it isn't even close to a competitor. It does not have anywhere and no prospect of having any kind of military presence in the region as the United States does. Over time, that could change, but I mean, time is years and decades. It does not have the kind of security partnerships and alliances with the countries that the United States does, and it can't provide security solutions to those countries. So while the competition is there, and clearly countries are making adjustments for it, that doesn't necessarily mean that, and we shouldn't be taken as a kind of a diminish or disappearance of the United States as a key factor here. But it does affect confidence, it does affect attitudes, and of course at that time, any distancing from the United States by any of its partners may just sort of add fuel to that perception. So obviously when the Saudis sign deals with Iran under Chinese sponsorship or join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as they appear to be, that looks like it. If there's tension and distancing between the United States and Israel around what's happening in these protests, that also could be seen to add fuel, not because Israel is turning to China, but just because it seems to add fuel to the notion that the United States is less influential. But goes to that Aluf's last point. If this is this underlying tension in Israeli society, where it affects the United States is on this issue of military readiness. The United States counts on a great partnership with a peer intelligence service and a military partnership where the other partner brings a great deal of capabilities to the table. But if people don't show up, that's going to change. Now, why not people show up? There's these tensions of religious and secular have existed in Israeli society, but they can kind of coexist alongside each other. It's where people who are not religious feel that the religious part of society will begin to dictate to them how they will live their lives. And they are not the ones necessarily serving. In fact, many of the ministers from the parties who are driving this agenda have not served in the military. And so those who do are saying that this is not, I don't think that's a very sustainable kind of situation for Israel to retain the kind of capability and unity of purpose that it serves its own interests, but also makes it such a valuable partner to the United States.
Thank you all. So now we're this was fantastic. Now we're opening it up for questions from the audience, and I'm going to read some of those questions. So how would the Israeli protesters react if the Biden administration were to start leveraging its power, such as conditioning military aid or force a compromise and so on? What would be the reaction domestically? Is it going to help, or is it going to produce a backlash? Aluf, you want to speculate on that? how it's going to play out?
American support is crucial for Israeli, all the way from the left to mainstream and center, and I would say the softer and more moderate parts of the right wing. They would not want to see the U.S. abandoning Israel. They would not want to see the U.S. Conditioning or taking back some of its military support, both in terms of budget and sophisticated technology, intelligence cooperation, and so on. There are those among the far right or the more religious right to them that say we could fight without the United States, we don't care about them, and but this is not a mainstream position in Israel. So clearly, any American involvement or any American unhappiness with what's happening in Israel means a lot to many Israelis. Would that be enough to stop Netanyahu? And Netanyahu understands it. But the counter argument of the right wing, even among those who do appreciate American support, is that all we have to do is wait out until Trump is back or DeSantis or some other Republican, and they are going to give us a carte blanche to do whatever we want anyway. They are the ideological twins of the Israeli right, so it's just a matter of buying time until Biden is gone.
Thank you, Alf. Anyone else on this? Or another question that came in. Obviously, if we think about the judicial reform, you can't really separate Benjamin Netanyahu's own legal issues from it, right? So the question is, if there are claims for a relationship between Bibi's cases and the reform, as if Bibi has an interest and a conflict of interest dealing with the overall, like what are the implications then there on his future, his legal troubles, and what anyone wants to jump in on that?
It's me again. So look, the trial is going on very slowly. It's actually now in some kind of impasse. The main testimony was already heard from the prosecution, not Netanyahu. Netanyahu is yet to come to the stand. But clearly, before his trial, Netanyahu paid very little attention to dealing with the judiciary. He was trying to portray himself as a protector of independence of the judiciary and so on. And more technically, the Attorney General forbids Netanyahu from dealing with the legal, with the judicial overall, because she said that it's conflict of interest, and he had agreed to be bound by a conflict of interest agreement a couple of years ago. Netanyahu passed a law, was able to pass a law protecting him from ouster if he breaches the conflict of interest agreement, which is not exactly an agreement because he did not sign, but is bound by the court. And he said, now I can do whatever I want. I can be involved. The Attorney General immediately sent him a letter saying, no, you cannot. It's illegal. So it's hanging in the air. Clearly, it serves Netanyahu because it can distance himself from the issue. And it's a true blue Netanyahu. For many years, whenever he does controversial things, especially vis-a-vis his own base, like compromising on the overhaul, he would always like to hide behind someone else. I don't build enough in the settlements as I want to because of Biden, because of Obama. I don't bomb Iran because of the Americans. I don't do this because of this or that other person.
In the past, though, he's had a coalition with people on both sides, so he could tack back and forth between the left and right wings of the coalition, or center and right wings, and so that blame structure was kind of internal. In this case, really, he's being pulled only in one direction by the coalition. So the natural place he would turn, of course, as an excuse, if he was looking for one, is Biden, is the United States. But there's that tension. Do you want to have to blame that on Biden? Is that legitimate when people say, well, it's about a domestic Israeli matter? But that I think plays into the dialogue that we're hearing at the moment between the two governments.
So does he have? Remember the beginning when when he just formed a coalition and he came out and said, "Don't worry about the far right factions. I have control over the situation. I control the coalition." does he really have still? Do you think he has control? Do you think he controlled the coalitions, or he's at the moment where they control him?
Look, it's always an interplay. You know, even the most sophisticated and successful and strong prime ministers in Israel's history were bound by their own parties or their coalitions. Netanyahu still enjoys very strong control within Likud. And the Gallant case is interesting to watch because for the first time in years that anyone in the Likud rebelled against Netanyahu and stayed on. The previous ones, like Gideon Sa'ar, they just left to establish their own political parties. Gallant stood up to Netanyahu and is still in office. If he stays on, even with some sort of apology or whatever, that means that Netanyahu is not fully controlling Likud anymore. And so it's an interplay. Does Netanyahu have control over foreign policy? I think he does. You could see that when Ben-Gvir, the leader of the Kahanists, became the minister of national security, which is the police, he went to Temple Mount on his first day in office. In the past, such visits created huge controversy, violence. The Second Intifada exploded after Ariel Sharon visited Temple Mount in similar circumstances. Bibi neutralized the Ben-Gvir visit almost immediately. And clearly the rift with Biden is the most serious foreign policy crisis that he's had in years. Not being invited to Washington, that used to be kind of almost automatic invitation. And bear in mind that Netanyahu came back to office after a year and a half in opposition. So it's not that he was there 3 months ago. And therefore it's a trouble for him. And he would have to show that he's really in control. You know, he went to these weekend trips to Italy, Berlin, London, and the leaders there went out of their way to show how unimportant the visit was. Prime Minister Sunak in London refused to have his picture taken with Netanyahu on Downing Street. There were protesters running after Netanyahu everywhere he went. This is not the global leader that Netanyahu likes to portray, as Netanyahu likes to portray himself to the Israeli public. So he has to do something to improve it.
Yeah, and he's weaker domestically in the polls. He's weaker, so that is another area. All right, we have 5 minutes. So last question for all of you: where do you think we are with this 1 month, 2 months from here? Anyone wants to make wild predictions? Well,
first of all, we have to go through the 75th anniversary of Israel Independence Day in 4 weeks. In the past, it was supposed to be a huge celebration. Now it's unclear if there will be one celebration, 2 separate celebrations. Would there be protests in the national ceremonies on Memorial Days for the Holocaust victims and for fallen soldiers, and on Independence Day itself? So that's a major public test of it. But I think that within a month or two, we're going to be more or less in the same situation, maybe a little bit more violent.
More violent.
Yeah.
So, clashes between the right-wing protesters and
the right-wing launched a campaign. Netanyahu launched a campaign, which is to tell the right-wing voters that what the protesters shown is that they are second-class citizens, that their votes count less than the votes of the pilots, of the protesting physicians, of the high-tech entrepreneurs who are threatening to leave Israel with their companies, and of the judiciary and of the academics and the presidents of research universities, etc. So the campaign now is to tell the right-wingers, look, you were shunned by these arrogant elitists. Now you have to fight back. And now, when people are fighting against each other, you have violence, and it may spread. And now, bear in mind also that Ben-Gvir's precondition for Netanyahu to support, in return for his support for the timeout in the judicial overhaul, he received authority from Netanyahu to build his own militia, kind of civil guard under the command of the minister, which is very, very troubling.
Very troubling.
Clearly, this is aimed to be a very violent group aimed at Arab citizens and protesters. and other people who are not in favor of the government.
Thank you, Aluf. Lisa, Dan, closing remarks?
Well, as somebody who teaches authoritarianism, you'll forgive me a measure of cynicism here. I actually think the 75th anniversary is a perfect opportunity to create significant problems of anti-Arab violence, both within Israel and in the West Bank. That's a kind of move that rather than go against the protesters, you create violence in a different context that serves both to upend the issues around the protests, and yet you can't be, blamed for going against the protesters. So to me, what it seems the next 6 weeks to a couple of months, I think it's going to be very violent, but I think it's going to be mostly violence because, look, it's true. These are settlers, leaders in the government. They've been saying this sort of stuff for decades. They're now about as empowered as they're ever going to be, unless, the reforms actually do go through. But they're about as powerful. And so why would they not take advantage of that? So I think there is going to be a lot of violence, but I think that's what it's going to look like. And then there's going to be a temptation to say, well, you have this uprising of violence, and so we have to rally around the flag and so forth. That's a kind of confusing the picture a little bit that I think would be very productive for the government.
I'll offer maybe just the slightly less pessimistic version here.
Thank you, Dan.
I mean, there is a negotiation that's being sponsored by the president of Israel, President Herzog, to try to come to some sort of consensus, some sort of broadly accepted version of rebalancing of the branches of the government. Even many of the protesters say, yes, they can see that there's some adjustments that should be made in the court's powers without the full sort of elimination of them. And maybe 80% of Israeli citizens can agree on that. Not the far right, not the far left, but that is a possible pathway. And of course, that's what President Biden has been encouraging, that process of getting to consensus, of making sure that if you do fundamental changes in a democratic system, you do it slowly, transparently, and through a consultative process. So there's a lot of buy-in, so they're enduring and accepted. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, I'm not predicting, but there is at least a pathway to do that. A lot will depend on whether the prime minister wants to take that off-ramp, that pathway, or whether he wants that to be a cover for eventually delivering for his base and these other members of his coalition what they most want and what he has sort of promised them. But of course, as long as we're in that kind of limbo, and hopefully without violence, but possibly with, that I think keeps a lot of the other things on hold. The kind of coordination that normally goes on between the United States and Israel, and lots of other things. Again, this issue, when I'll just close with this, when the prime minister came into office 3 months ago, he said his priorities were coordinating with the United States on Iran, expanding the Abraham Accords, including Saudi Arabia, and dealing with the cost of living and its impacts on the lives of citizens. Well, very little has happened on any of those over the last 3 months, because all the oxygen has been sucked out of the political discourse on this one very, very divisive issue. And it's possible that if that's the case for months going forward, and protests, counter protests and negotiations, and will they, won't they, we'll have 3 or 6 or more months go by without really addressing a lot of those other very, very important issues.
Yeah. Okay, this is it's 11 o'clock. I want to thank the panelists for their insights, for being with us today, and taking the time to offer really interesting perspective as we started. This is, really unprecedented events in Israel, a lot of uncertainty. We are going to keep on following the events in Israel, and might do another rapid response webinar later in the year. I want to thank everybody for being with us. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.